Do you know what a Rowhammer exploit is? Ever thought you could design a certain structure of data that would correlate to physical circuits being formed in the RAM of a computer? Well, there's an exploit going around called Rowhammer, also written as Rowhammer. It is a security exploit that takes advantage of an unintended and undesirable side effect in dynamic random access memory, DRAM, in which individual memory cells interact electrically between themselves and other cells near them by leaking their charges, possibly changing the contents of nearby memory rows that were not addressed in the original memory access. This circumvention of the isolation between DRAM memory cells results from the high cell density in modern-day DRAM caches and can be triggered by specially crafted memory access patterns that rapidly activate the same memory rows numerous times. In dynamic RAM, DRAM, each bit of stored data occupies a separate memory cell that is electrically implemented with one capacitor and one transistor. The charge state of a capacitor, charged or discharged, is what determines whether a DRAM cell stores a 1 or a 0 as a binary value. Huge numbers of DRAM memory cells are packed into integrated circuits, together with some additional logic that organizes the cells for the purposes of reading, writing, and refreshing the data. Memory cells, blue squares in both illustrations, are further organized into matrices and addressed through rows and columns. A memory address applied to a matrix is broken into the row address and column address, which are processed by the row and column address decoders, in both illustrations, vertical and horizontal green rectangles respectively. After a row address selects the row for a read operation, the selection is also known as row activation. Bits from all cells in the row are transferred into the sense amplifiers that form the row buffer, red squares in both illustrations, from which the exact bit is selected using the column address. Consequently, read operations are of a destructive nature because the design of DRAM requires memory cells to be rewritten after their values have been read by transferring the cell charges into the row buffer. Write operations decode the addresses in a similar way, but as a result of the design, entire rows must be rewritten for the value of a single bit to be changed. The opportunity for the Rowhammer effect to occur in DDR3 memory is primarily attributed to DDR3's high density of memory cells and the results of associated interactions between the cells, while rapid DRAM row activations have been determined as the primary cause. Frequent row activations cause voltage fluctuations on the associated row selection lines, which have been observed to induce higher than natural discharge rates in capacitors belonging to nearby, adjacent in most cases, memory rows, which are called victim rows. If the affected memory cells are not refreshed before they lose too much charge, disturbance errors occur. Tests show that a disturbance error may be observed after performing around 139,000 subsequent memory row accesses with cache flushes, and that up to one memory cell in every 1,700 cells may be susceptible. Those tests also show that the rate of disturbance errors is not substantially affected by increased environment temperature, while it depends on the actual contents of DRAM, because certain bit patterns result in significantly higher disturbance error rates. A variant called double-sided hammering involves targeted activations of two DRAM rows surrounding a victim row. In the illustration provided in this section, this variant would be activating both yellow rows with the aim of inducing bit flips in the purple row, which in this case would be the victim row. Tests show that this approach may result in a significantly higher rate of disturbance errors compared to the variant that activates only one of the victim row's neighboring DRAM rows. As DRAM vendors have deployed mitigations, patterns had to become more sophisticated to bypass Rowhammer mitigations. More recent Rowhammer patterns include non-uniform frequency-based patterns. These patterns consist of many double-sided aggressors pairs where each of them is hammered with a different frequency, phase, and amplitude. Using this and synchronizing patterns with the refresh command, it is possible to very effectively determine blind spots where the mitigation is not able to provide protection anymore. Based on this idea, academics built a Rowhammer fuzzer named Blacksmith 21 that can bypass existing mitigations on all DDR4 devices. Different methods exist for more or less successful detection, prevention, correction, or mitigation of the Rowhammer effect. Tests show that simple error correction code, which uses an error correction code, or ECC, to detect and correct n-bit data corruption which occurs in memory. ECC memory is used in most computers where data corruption cannot be tolerated, like industrial control applications, critical databases, and infrastructural memory caches. Typically, ECC memory maintains a memory system immune to single-bit errors. The data that is read from each word is always the same as the data that had been written to it, even if one of the bits actually stored has been flipped to the wrong state. Most non-ECC memory cannot detect errors, although some non-ECC memory with parity support allows detection but not correction. Normal single error correction and double error detection capabilities is not advisable because they are not able to correct or detect all observed disturbance errors, because some of them include more than 2 flipped bits per memory word. Since the release of Ivy Bridge microarchitecture, Intel's Xeon processors support the so-called pseudo-target row refresh, PTRR, that can be used in combination with PTRR-compliant DDR3 dual inline memory modules, or DIMMs, to mitigate the Rowhammer effect by automatically refreshing possible victim rows, with no negative impact on performance or power consumption. When used with DIMMs that are not PTRR compliant, these Xeon processors by default fall back on performing DRAM refreshes at twice the usual frequency, which results in slightly higher memory access latency, and may reduce the memory bandwidth by up to 2-4% implementation of hardware that uses target row refresh, or TRR, internally that identifies possible victim rows by counting the number of row activations and comparing it against predefined chip-specific maximum activate count, MAC, and maximum activate window, TMAW values, and refreshes these rows to prevent bit flips is not effective in all vectors of attack. The MAC value is the maximum total number of row activations that may be encountered on a particular DRAM row within a time interval that is equal or shorter than the TMAW amount of time before its neighboring rows are identified as victim rows. TRR may also flag a row as a victim row if the sum of row activations for its 2 neighboring rows reaches the MAC limit within the TMAW time window. This race condition can be exploited. Research showed that TRR mitigations deployed on DDR4 UDIMMs and LPDDR4X chips from devices produced between 2019 and 2020 are not effective in protecting against Rowhammer. In July 2015, a group of security researchers published a paper that describes an architecture and instruction set independent way for exploiting the Rowhammer effect. Instead of relying on the CLFlush instruction to perform cache flushes, this approach achieves uncached memory accesses by causing a very high rate of cache eviction using carefully selected memory access patterns. Although the cache replacement policies differ between processors, this approach overcomes the architectural differences by employing an adaptive cache eviction strategy algorithm. The proof of concept for this approach is provided both as a native code implementation and as a pure JavaScript implementation that runs on Firefox 39. The JavaScript implementation, called Rowhammer uses large typed arrays and relies on their internal allocation using large pages. As a result, it demonstrates a very high-level exploit of a very low-level vulnerability. In October 2016, researchers published Rowhammer, an Android application that uses Rowhammer together with other methods to reliably gain root access on several popular smartphones. In May 2021, a Google research team announced a new exploit half-double that takes advantage of the worsening physics of some of the newer DRAM chips. Rowhammer is a concerning security exploit leveraging unintended side effects in modern DRAM. Its potential for privilege escalation and network-based attacks poses serious threats. Mitigation efforts include error correction codes and hardware support, but sophisticated patterns continue to challenge defenses. As demonstrated by Google's Project Zero and subsequent exploits, the danger persists, necessitating ongoing vigilance in the realm of memory security. Stay tuned for the latest developments and safeguards against this evolving threat.